Welcome to Bodies in Focus, centering the body in pedagogy and teaching. As we begin today and we wait for folks to join us, we invite you, if you like, to write in the chat where you are joining from, your background, institution, education, disciplines, and/or what you're curious about when joining our conversation. And it'll just be another minute or two as we welcome people. And we'll take just another moment to invite everyone to write in the chat where you are joining from, your background, what you're curious about when joining our conversation. Just another little bit here and we'll get started. All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from today. My name is Sarah Lomas-Flesch, and I serve as the Assistant Director at the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th session of Bodies in Focus, centering the body in pedagogy and teaching. Bodies in Focus is part of a multi-year initiative supported by the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies in collaboration with over 10 regional studies centers in the United States. I would like to thank our co-sponsoring institutions and our scholarly consultants for their support in this endeavor. I would also like to extend a special thank you to my colleagues Zsuzsanna Magdo at the University of Pittsburgh, Alicia Baca and Emma Pratt at Ohio State University, and Jennifer Tischler at UW-Madison for their organizational support. As a reminder, we have 90 minutes allocated for today's session, including questions and discussion with the audience. Audience members will have the opportunity to share questions and comments using Zoom's Q&A function, and we can also unmute audience members upon request to facilitate ADA access. Please use Zoom's raise hand function to ask to be unmuted. Additionally, all panels in this series are being recorded and captioned automatically via Zoom during each session, and subsequently, recordings are being professionally captioned and made available a few days after each session on the program web pages of the 3 organizing centers. If you have any questions about accessibility or wish to request other accommodations for our next session, please email cease@osu.edu 2 weeks ahead of time. That's CSEEES@osu.edu. And my colleague Alicia will add that email address to the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today's panel. Frances Bernstein is Clinical Professor of Russian and Slavic Studies at New York University. She teaches courses in the history of medicine, disability and the body, the history of sexuality, and Russian history. She has just completed a manuscript for Northern Illinois University Press entitled Missing in Action, Erasing Disability from the Great Patriotic War. Today's panelists will introduce themselves in more detail as part of their presentation and conversation. In brief, Linda Lapina is Associate Professor at Roskilde University, Denmark. Nadia Chushak holds a PhD in anthropology from Melbourne University, Australia, and teaches courses on sexuality and feminisms at Kyiv Mohila Academy in Kyiv, Ukraine. I'll now turn things over to Fran. Questions and comments are welcome anytime during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome to everybody. I am delighted to be chairing this panel and delighted to hear from our two participants, and I'm going to immediately turn it over to them, though I should say also that questions are welcome at any time. You can write your question down in the Q&A, and I will make sure that I can give that question to our participants. Later in this session, there will also be an opportunity of several minutes for everyone to reflect on the conversation thus far, or whatever you deem appropriate. And if you need to meet to share any other information, please just send it to me in the Q&A, and I will make sure to relay that information. So let me turn it over directly to Linda and Nadia and say again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Fran, and thank you so much, Sarah, for the introductions. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today with you. And thank you also, audience members, for coming and being here. We thought we would start with giving some attention to our bodies, since the topic of today's session is the body in pedagogy and teaching. So before you hear more about our practice, about the ways we work, about how we teach and how we do research and engage in knowledge creation with students and colleagues and others, I would like us to spend a couple of minutes to acknowledge and take some care of our bodies. And I would like to invite you to start by making sure that you sit maybe just a tad more comfortably if it's possible. Maybe you need to adjust your posture. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, or let them look outside the window. Maybe you need to stretch. Feel free to do that, or yawn, stretch your face, whatever you feel like your body needs at this current moment. And also notice if you, during these few minutes, feel a bit restless or impatient, or you want me to get to the point. That is also an embodied reaction. Or if any other feelings or thoughts come up, you can also acknowledge and notice those. And otherwise, for this short moment of arriving into this shared space with us, I would like to invite you to think a bit about your day so far and where you are arriving from. It could be you never left your home. It could also be that you've been to many different places, taking a train, driving a car, riding a bike, walking. It could be you've been teaching. I've been doing that. So revisit the day that you've had so far and how you got to be here with us and what brought you here. So it's also about all the decisions, all the events of your life that brought you here. And of course, you don't have the time or the need to remember all of that, but you can think back at how you first heard about this panel today. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't. Maybe it was an invitation from a friend or something you saw somewhere. But then maybe you can also think further back at some interest of yours that led you to pursue whatever you're doing that caused you to be here today. Maybe it's something that reaches years in the past. Maybe it has to do with significant others, with decisions taken a long time ago. So as we arrive in the space today that we share, we're also coming from many different places, and we're carrying our histories with us in different ways. And our body remembers those histories as we're present. So that's also something for us to think about. And I'm going to soon transition into speaking about my practice and myself. But if you feel like it, you can keep pondering these topics for later on in our conversation, because for me, these histories that we carry and that shape us are very much a part of how I approach teaching and knowledge creation. And I'll speak more about that. First, I'll say a bit more about myself. I'm originally educated as a psychologist here in Denmark, where I live, at the University of Copenhagen. And quite quickly, I left psychology because I found it to be too focused on the individual. I was more interested in larger societal, political, relational processes. And I went on to do my PhD, where I was using intersectional feminist theory to look at how differences mattered in urban spaces, particularly thinking about gentrification, exclusion and inclusion in urban change. And then I've been working more and more with arts-based methods and also sensory ethnography and autoethnography, also writing quite a few texts about my own migrant positionality in Denmark, because I moved to Denmark from Latvia when I was 18, and how this positionality, which has shifted over the years, could be used as a location from which to examine whiteness, Danishness, and other markers on the body. So for me, my history, or the history that I carry, has very much been a part of my research now for many years. Also in the past years, when I've been working more with artistic research and arts-based methods. My movement practice, because I'm also a dancer, is more and more explicitly a part of how I teach, in a way that I mention it and acknowledge it, but it's been a part of how I move in the university. I don't need to physically dance for that to be with me. So for me, these connections are very strong, and it's also part of how I approach our students. I'm very lucky to be teaching in very diverse classrooms, where the students come from many different backgrounds, both with regards to geography, linguistic diversity, of course, gender, race, class, but also different knowledge traditions and different ways of inhabiting body minds. So for me, it's very important for students to feel safe, to actively express and draw on their histories and this richness of knowledges that they bring with them in my teaching. And this is where body is also a key element of that. So that's what I wanted to say about myself as we begin. And now I'd like to invite you, Nadia, to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Linda, and also great thank you to all event organizers, to people who created this panel, so to all the technical details, invited us all to be here. It's a pleasure. I also just wanted to tell that if you feel like still writing about yourself, please do this, but use maybe Q&A session window in the Zoom, because I think that we would all love to hear more about people who are present here and why you are here. So if you can just very briefly note down why you arrived to this particular event. And right, so about myself, I did a PhD in anthropology on memory politics in contemporary Serbia when I was in Australia. But after I finished my PhD, I moved to Ukraine without actually planning to stay there at first. But then events happened, history happened, and I stayed in Ukraine since, teaching in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. I first started teaching the sociology of sexuality course, and eventually also started teaching a course on feminisms. However, I have to say that I feel a little bit like an imposter here, and it's of course part of our training as the people who are trained as women get, having this imposter syndrome, and also particular people who come from the Eastern Europe, post-socialist Europe, wherever you call this part of the world. But also, yeah, I feel like I'm a bit of an imposter for a panel which focuses on body in teaching, because even though I teach courses on sexuality and feminisms, I always feel like I do not pay enough of attention to the body. This because I think that you can have like 10 courses within a course on feminism, which would be just dealing with different aspects of studying human body and also non-human bodies, right? But then, of course, we all work within time constraints of one semester or but also this started changing for me a couple of years ago when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and that significantly impacted the way I can live my day on my life on a day-to-day basis, but also how I can teach or how I cannot teach. This kind of invited me to incorporate more and more of crib theory in my teaching. I don't have a separate course on crib theory yet, and I don't think that I will ever will, but that's another story for another time. But I tried to incorporate texts from crib theorists and also try to incorporate more practices from crib activists, right? Because I think that what inspires me so much in crib theory, just as well as in queer theory and in feminism, is how actually firmly interweaved are theory and activism, contrary to what some critics are saying. So I think that would be all in lieu of invitation, sorry, introduction on my behalf. And yeah.
Yeah, if I can take over, because as you know, we decided to shape this as a conversation, right?
Yeah.
I noticed what you said, Nadia, about not feeling like you are paying enough attention to the body in your teaching. And I feel that way as well. And I feel that it's a continuous learning and unlearning process. And also that's something I've been discussing with the students that I was teaching today, because it was the first day of a course, about how on one hand, it's up to us to co-create a learning environment. It's up to us to, if we need to stand up or use the space in ways that in ways that make it more accessible to us and that make it more including for our learning processes. And at the same time, we have been taught in different ways, because we also come from different places and we inhabit different body minds. But we have, most of us, been taught that some of the things that would make it much easier for us to be there are not appropriate. And also that they do not belong in learning and teaching spaces. And I remember when we had the conversation to prepare this panel, we were speaking about introductions, and we were speaking about me doing this welcoming arrival exercise, and about how both of us, you were the first one to voice it, but how both of us have felt skeptical in the past towards such interventions, right? Because, I mean, I'm still unlearning this, how I, it somehow seems less academic or less strenuous or less serious, or also the university where I teach is known as an alternative university. And I would like to wear this with pride, but it sometimes also becomes, we all know this, like bashing of gender studies, and sometimes it becomes a point of criticism against the university. The pedagogies that I'm most proud of can become, this red piece of cloth for someone to attack. So I think there's a lot of historical, political context in the different places we are that hinders us in what we're trying to do. I mean, I feel that with my students and my colleagues.
Mhm. Yeah, Linda, absolutely agree with you. And thank you for bringing in already this concept of body minds into conversation. Because all this time when I was thinking about our conversation, I was always like, but why are we focusing only on bodies? Shouldn't we also be focusing on minds as well? That we go way beyond this too old division and the dual split between body and the mind. And that's actually really challenging. One of the biggest challenges that I have to work against when teaching sociology students in my department, because especially those who are not coming to my courses because they are already interested in queer theory or feminism, but the ones especially, okay, we'll not be doing any more generalizations here, but we can, I think we can imagine what kind of body minds would be particularly skeptical about division, uniting body and mind, and saying, no, but no, what about mind, which should be the rational and objective, and how about all our wonderful quantitative methods in sociology, right? Body minds and what they are
Nadia
struggling.
and Linda, can I interject for 1 second? For the
Sure.
benefits of people coming from other spaces, maybe you could spend a minute explaining what body mind means and where that notion comes from and the way that's been used.
Sure. I'll tell how I know the concept, and maybe Linda. I suspect Linda would be the expert to say, but just, I learned about this concept first from the theory texts of Black scholars who are writing against the Eurocentric Western philosophy, and precisely criticizing it for this division into rational mind and the body. But I also know that this is a concept which is also used in psychology. So maybe Linda.
Yeah, I don't know it from psychology. I also know it from
Okay.
Black feminist theory. And one book that I would really recommend is Mina Salami's Sensuous Knowledge, that goes more in depth in discussing embodied knowledge. And I think part of my psychology, I'm sure there are many psychology departments where people learn about body minds and do research in that, but it wasn't a part of my training as a psychologist, unfortunately. So it's not to say that it's not that psychology does not have valuable perspectives to offer here. But it's also something that, again, continues to be a topic of exploration, a topic of relearning. I think parallels could be drawn here to a concept like nature cultures, from Donna Haraway, where it becomes, it's still, I mean, I'm sure that I will say things, or maybe even have said things during this conversation that separate the body and mind. So it's hard. I'm also thinking back at the discussion I had with my students today, where I felt we were discussing affect theory and how a particular take on affect theory that talked about strategic intensities, and how this word strategy is often invested with, this idea of rationality. If we're strategic, that means that we're thinking rationally. And we were talking about how we were skeptical of the idea of rationality, but then also how we always get caught up in that. And for me, there's actually, some time ago, I might have been a bit discouraged by this feeling that it's like this continuous looping where I'm not sure that this process of unlearning will ever be complete, but now I feel that it's a part of it, because I also feel that the idea of learning as a road from A to B is not something that works in my experience. And it is way more this spiraling or looping or returning to something or returning. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. I absolutely share this sentiment of yours, especially I might have been prone to this idealized notion of learning as a journey struggle somewhere, and you struggle hard enough, and then you all of the, I don't know, sociology corpus or anthropology corpus or whatever, right? But then I think that that became most obvious to me that it's impossible after I was diagnosed and finally had an answer, even though I'm very, very skeptical of diagnosis. And there's a whole another conversation that we could have here about why diagnosis is quite a problematic concept and how problematically it is often actually used. But when I had this diagnosis in hand and I could start piecing together what may be happening with me and in particular with my brain, because before the diagnosis, no one could tell me why, for instance, I cannot focus my attention for longer periods of time any longer, neither on written text nor talk on lectures or anywhere, right? I think that this connection between body and mind became very, very obvious to me back then. And it became very obvious to me how really unrealistic are these concepts of your education should look like attending a series of lectures where you listen for 60 minutes. And then if you have a chance to ask a question, you'll get an answer to the question that started fermenting in your brain in the very first 5 minutes of the lecture, right? If you're not lucky, then too bad, right? So by the way, there's an invitation for you to start asking questions or writing anything you want to write in Q&A, so it doesn't sound like we're just talking, because we honestly wanted to have this as a conversation between all of us rather than experts and the audiences who are here just to listen. So yeah.
And I just answered the question, and you can see us type in the chat because our faces will light up in the white light from the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another thing that I mean, it also you inspire me a lot, Nadia. I was thinking about also how I forgot to mention certain things when I was introducing myself that I had wanted to mention. And for me, this also relates to these histories of what I carry in my body and how they don't seem to, even though I've been trying for many years and very actively trying. And I'm also now in this position where, you know, I get to stand in front of the room, so I should feel more secure than if I was, you know, sitting in one of the chairs that are not in front of the room. But I did not mention my Baltic lineage. I didn't mention my traditions and these bodies of knowledge that really inspired the work that I do. It's easier to talk about. And I was challenged when I was defending my PhD. There was this wonderful remark from the committee about how I was crediting French post-structural philosophers. And you can ask me their names, I'll type them on the chat, but I'd rather not mention their names. But I wasn't crediting my grandmother, because I also wrote about my grandmother and embodied knowledge and learning from being with non-human entities like plants and bodies of water. And for me, these omissions are really interesting. And these omissions often have to do also with aspects of our body minds that have been more connected with the body. That is not part of what we're supposed to be doing, or it's not supposed to be informing our knowledge creation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, speaking about things that are not accepted as a part of this intricate dance we do and call it an academia, right, is really difficult. And that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. How do we put bodies into focus when these bodies are marginalized, right? And it's not a new question. I mean, for hundreds of years already, people from different parts of theorizing, so schools of thoughts have been talking about it, how difficult and challenging it is. Yet, nevertheless, it really is a challenge when you have to do it during communication, especially with students, especially if it involves you actually making a coming out. And it became especially obvious for me as well when I had to come out as a person with multiple chronic illnesses. Especially when we are reading texts by crib scholars and students were like reading and commenting about how, for instance, incapable are people with depression. And here I am sitting with a chronic depression, which has been a part of most of my life, listening to these comments, not a singular comment, but quite repetitive comments, which actually also say something about Ukrainian society, how Ukrainian society is still quite sanist and hostile towards, again, mental illnesses, right? This sorts of comings out, which actually expose you to students, are very difficult, even though, I mean, one could say that they have a very teachable moment, but then again, as with any other sorts of coming out, yeah, that's a big question: who gains from those teachable moments in the end, right?
Yeah. And I'm thinking about other moments in my teaching practice that it is the question of marginalized bodies and how their possibilities to participate in a learning space that we share. Because I'm teaching a course that is quite a big course. It's around 100 students. And I meet this cohort of 100 students repeatedly, which is really a privilege. So they get to know me. But this is also something that has happened increasingly in the past years. In the beginning, I think the first time when I invited a dancer and a choreographer as a guest teacher on a class about embodied knowledges to actually do something that I would not be facilitating, but so there would be another person, another body with me in the room, and we could do this together. And I learned so much from the dancer who did this. And in many ways, we had really tried our best to prepare. But some of the things we could not do in the possible way because of space limitations. So we were this big group of people. And part of what we did, it was early October, was to go outside to do some exercises, some simple physical exercises. And we had talked a lot about how we wanted to make it really easy to follow. We also wanted to make it clear that people didn't have to come with us, that people could go back inside. But in the end, these exercises were not equally accessible and equally interesting to all of our students. The fact that we were outside and there could be people looking at us, so we didn't have the safety of an enclosed space. That was, for example, a big issue for some of our students. Some of them said afterwards, and I mean, for me, this, again, that for me also raises this question that you mentioned, Nadia, who pays the cost, who bears the cost of valuable learning moments? Because the students were very generous afterwards to share with me and the others why they had felt that these embodied activities were not accessible or were not appropriate for some of them. But I'm not sure that, I mean, that was valuable for me and probably many other students, but I'm not sure I wouldn't have put them in that situation on purpose. But the other things that they shared were that, for example, as a racialized minority in Denmark, they already felt under scrutiny, and then to jump in a body that has different shapes, sizes, forms, abilities, that could be very exposing and very uncomfortable. And in some sense, my intention with this activity was to provide ways for students to get involved, for us to get involved. Also for those of us who felt that maybe the traditional academic setting of sitting in a chair all like for hours and hours and hours on end did not feel inclusive and did not feel that this is something we felt was, you know, that for people who felt like they had this need to move, for example. And then, yes, it might be true, people have a need to move, but in this way that was facilitated by us, it risked exposing them even further. So, and that's one example I'd like to hear from you, but I also have more examples I'd really like to share, which really put these dilemmas in the foreground, that by trying to do something different, it could actually reproduce some structures of marginalization that the students are already feeling on their body minds.
Yeah, that's such a good example. I mean, part of me listening to your stories is just very envious that you actually spent time with students in live settings and get to teach them live, as opposed, because for people who don't know, in Ukraine, higher education didn't go out of the Zoom era, because after the more or less pandemic lulling down, the war started, and since then, like majority, I'm not sure majority, but at least at my university, majority of the classes are still taught online. So there's that, and that's another question. How do we actually, because whenever I'm in the last year or year and a half, I've noticed that international academic events that happen online, people usually just joke about having forgotten everything about Zoom, having forgotten everything about the terrible Zoom era. And yeah, so that obviously didn't happen for everyone, right? But also, what I was thinking about when you were talking, Linda, is precisely how difficult it is to create a space which would be open for everyone and would be helping everyone to learn, to express themselves, to communicate, to exchange ideas, if we really put body minds in focus. Because that's one of the things that has started really overwhelming me after I started sharing more and more with the students about my health conditions, but also inviting them to come forward and inviting. So one of the things that I do, because I know that teaching online, I mean, we all know, we've all been through that, is super stressful for students, but also it's super stressful for students who live in a country that is in state of murderous war, right? So what I'm trying to do in the beginning of the semester, to the best of my abilities, even though those abilities are not that good, for reasons I've already told you about, but I try to talk to students to come up to me and to share, if they are comfortable, what special assistance they would require from the course, especially a course that is dealing sometimes with some heavy topics and happening in online settings. And I can't say that I'm overwhelmed by student responses to that, but I have to say that quite a few students actually try to talk to me about their needs and what they need from the educational process to help them actually, rather than to make them feel even more stupid when they started. But also, I have this particular additional insight from communicating with my friends and with some of whom we cooperate in activist milieus, right? And when we started to think what it really means to create an inclusive space, right? And how it's always, I think it's always impossible task if you think about it as a, I don't know, a building you can build with all the ramps, with all the elevators, with all the bathrooms, it still will be excluding someone. and if you take this as a metaphor, it still will be happening in that way. So we always have to think about it as a never-ending process, which involves us being ashamed, or maybe ashamed, being embarrassed
Yeah.
of mistakes we did, but then learning to embrace them and learning to move from that place to somewhere better for and everyone involved, hopefully.
Can I
Yeah.
jump in with a question from the audience?
Sure.
Yes,
This is from
Francis.
Christina Frasher. I also wonder if you both might speak, if appropriate, the challenge of supporting, encouraging body-mind connection and embodied teaching, which are very much in conflict with institutional culture. Encouraging this aspect when the institution itself can be very anti-embodiment.
Yeah, that's such a good question, Christina. I'm sitting here going like, no, situation is horrible, but that's definitely one of the things that I was thinking when thinking about this conversation. Yes, it is a challenge. Yeah.
I think I'll answer your question linking it to the ideal of mastery, because that's also what inspired me in what you were talking about, Nadia. You were saying things about, I'm not sure you used those exact words, but daring to be awkward and fail and having humility. And I recently had the honor to supervise a master's thesis on the experiences of neurodivergent students at our university. And it was a brilliant master's thesis. But at the oral exam, we spoke about how the student had wanted to write more creatively and also did this. And these were texts that we discussed during our supervision sessions, but then they somehow, and also using autoethnography, but then somehow that disappeared from the master's thesis, basically from the analysis. And instead it was based on interviews and walking methodologies, which is also, of course, very exciting and interesting. But part of the findings were these, of course, imposter syndrome, but also always feeling like, even when, let's say, getting good grades, the students would question their abilities and they would feel that they were just essentially not a good student, and the university was not a space for them, or the institution was not a space for them. And we talked about Jack Halberstam's book, The Queer Art of Failure, and we talked about how hard it is to fail. And the reason why I'm talking about that in relation to your question as well is because the activity that I did with the students that I was telling about, many of the students said they were afraid to move wrong, even though it was just about moving a finger, or it could be just a finger, or it could be just jumping or bouncing or whatever. But there was this very clear feeling that they had to do it right. And I think it's hard to be a body in the right kind of way, and for some bodies more than others to have the feeling that, so I'm thinking that perfectionism and the institution being a place where the activities that take place are graded, are given credits for, are rewarded in particular ways. There's a hierarchy of good ways to be a student, bad ways to be a student. I think all of that is part of the difficulty of making space for embodied ways of knowing. Would you like to add something, Nadia?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. I'm just thinking about Christina's question still, because I think it's not even just the institution itself, right? I think our whole idea of education is very much anti-body-mind to a large extent, but also education does not exist in a vacuum. Education exists within a society. And I just remembered a couple of years ago, I tried to have a talk about uselessness as a concept, and one of the questions that that I was asked after the talk was from a teacher who said, a university professor from the university where I was giving this talk or whatever, who said, I absolutely relate to what you're saying, but at the same time, I understand that I need to teach students so that they can go on and be useful society members in this wide world that we are living in, right? So what should we do with this wonderful idea of celebrating uselessness, useless knowledge, useless methods, useless whatever? And I keep returning to this question like from time to time. And the only answer that I can think about, and I would love to hear if you have any ideas, both you, Linda, but also maybe people who are listening to our conversation right now. I think that just admitting that, I mean, the world that we live in is dysfunctional. And recently it has started unraveling even quicker at certain points, because in certain points it has been unraveling and at a tremendous speed already for some time, right? So I don't know, should we be asking ourselves this question, how to prepare students better for the world? If for the world that is already out there, should we be preparing students for, I don't know, commonly, jointly sitting down and asking difficult questions that no one wants to ask because they are not productive, they are not useful, they are not the proper way you should ask a question in a sociology research paper or whatever, right? So I think that my answer to this, which is quite idealist, to Christina's question, quite idealist, but I try somehow to implement this, is just to go and say, yeah, no, we work in a terrible institutions which are just against the students as they are against us. I mean, not all of us. Some people are in more privileged positions, some in less, but anyway. These institutions work to reaffirm and reuphold the world order, which is also absolutely unfair. So if we want to somehow, for me, right. So for me, it's just like how other way you can do it, right? If students want to learn how to do a very, I don't know, difficult statistical analysis, they will not sign up for my courses. They will sign up for statistical analysis class or whatever. But I also have some more specific ways, not only this idealism, that I try to offer to students as a way of supporting them. And it's also a combination of trying to think about what would be supporting the students, but also what would be supporting me. And I always hated marking, and I know that we can just pass a mic around the room and everyone will say how they hate marking, because honestly, what does marking has to do with teaching? Or at least the way the universities expect us to do marking and evaluation, right? So when I realized that I really don't have physical strength to do marking any more, after some research, I tried to introduce ungrading in my courses. And so basically, I'm sure that many of you have heard about ungrading, but for those who haven't, it's a practice which, again, can have many different versions of how people implement it. The way I do it is from the very beginning, students learn that I'm not going to be giving them any grades in the course. They are going to be grading themselves. For that, I try to offer them with the support throughout the semester. So they fill in 3 questionnaires or self-evaluation forms throughout the semester, which helps them to understand at which point they are right now. And in the end of the course, they kind of summarize it or whatever and suggest a mark for themselves. Nominally for the university, and also, yeah, also for some students, I have to admit it's not just nominally. There's also like a paragraph in syllabus which says that if I absolutely disagree with your mark, we'll have another conversation. You'll try to explain to me why you gave yourself this mark, because I can be just oblivious of all the work student has been doing during the semester, and my self-evaluation questionnaires can also miss that. So maybe student was really working, but I just don't see it, don't hear about it. So, and if the students after that conversation doesn't change his or her or theirs mind, then the grades that they gave to themselves initially will be the ones that will be put down in all the forms and submitted as an official grade for the course. And I had to refer to it only on a couple of occasions, because I was really anxious about first few times I did the ungrading, because I had this again and again, where this paranoia comes from. Why do we think that students want to trick us all the time, right? I had these ideas about these trickster students giving themselves like this absolutely high and undeserved quote unquote marks, and it actually doesn't work that way. The way students grade themselves, it coincides more or less with how I would grade them if I had to eventually. Couple of cases didn't work. Often, and the ones that I will focus here on, not a case but tendency, but again, people who are trained as women are the ones who tend to put much lower grades for themselves, much lower ones. I mean, I wouldn't say that this is a statistical tendency, because as you probably realized by now, me and statistics not friends, but still, it's something, an observable thing, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nadia, and thank you, Christina, for asking this question that is really opening up like a box of treasures, because now I both have specific examples to share, and I also want to speak a little bit about extractivism, which is inspired by Nadia's answer to these, talking about larger societal structures and how we treat ourselves and our environments. But I'll start with some specific examples. And the course that I was just teaching today, which is called Mobilities and Migration, I haven't implemented ungrading, but I've been very creative with how I interpret the study regulations, which say that the students have to hand in a textual product, and they have to hand it in 2 weeks after the course ends. So I've done two things. I make it very explicit that their textual product can be different kinds of text, and then I make it very clear how they can document writing these different texts, which could include poetry or creative writing, speculative fiction, or it could be very different texts. But for some of students, it's also a traditional academic text to use those. I'm not very fond of calling something traditional academic text or traditional way of doing research, but just to be brief. So I make it very as accessible as possible, also providing earlier examples of student work to do things that they might think are fun and that make it more theirs, while also acknowledging that it might be easier to do something they've done before. And also this is graded. So making it clear that there are certain chances they might feel like not taking. But then there's another program where I've been a part of, including in the study regulations, the so-called alternative project. And that's because a lot of the work at our university is project-based, where students work in groups, usually around 4 or 5 people, of course, from different backgrounds, working together on a topic of their own choice, where they also make the research design together and they work closely with the supervisor. And on their third semester, they can do now an alternative project, and that is described in the study regulations, an alternative project. So still very much within these confines of what is traditional and or regular and what is alternative. But that can include multiple media, that can include, very explicitly include, just now in January, I had a project where the students did a performance for their oral exam. They were in the experience lab, which is a black box we have in the basement of the university. And that was really, really amazing, but also difficult to be the examiner and to be so moved by this performance at the same time. The project was about playfulness. So of course they wanted to do a playful exam. So it's not, I very much experience in this situation these clashes on my own body, that I'm supposed to be the examiner here, but I also feel like really, being an audience. So those are the specific examples I thought like sharing. And then I just wanted to briefly address this when you spoke about the society at large and the state of our worlds. Nadia, I thought about extractivism, and then I shared a link in the Q&A because I'm doing some work about resting laboratories. And I shared a link to one that happened at the University of Copenhagen last December. And we're going to have one in an art gallery end of February. And the idea is to provide spaces to rest together rather than encouraging each other to compete and to perform. But these are also these spaces are so full of dilemmas, like who has the time to rest for even a whole day, which was the case in December. And also the case in December, I'm just going to touch this brief dilemma before, because I also feel I'm speaking for a long time, but some of the students who came to the resting laboratory we had at the University of Copenhagen in December were students of one of our local collaborators at the University of Copenhagen, who was also their examiner, who was also giving them work. So then to rest in the presence of your, let's say, supervisor, examiner, while you're also feeling stressed out by this course, it's like we were speaking about it afterwards. Like it's very tricky, right? Because I mean, the university pays my salary. So I mean, just that sentence, just that, right? So I'm very much part of reproducing these systems that I'm also trying to challenge. Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing question. Thank you so much.
And honestly, if anyone would like to add an answer to that, anyone from the audience or organizers, I would love to hear some other cases and examples.
But I actually think, Nadia, so I'm just going to introduce this to the audience. Because me and Nadia also had the idea of, because for us, like for me, I'll speak for myself, time is passing very quickly. And I think it's great to talk, and especially after such a great question from you, Christina. But we wanted to give you a couple of minutes to gather your thoughts and reflections, because it can also be hard to think of questions and comments, reflections while you're listening to us. So we wanted to give you a couple of minutes of silence, and we've written an invitation that I will share, and I'll do a screen share, and we'll be quiet just for 5 minutes for you to have time to write things in the Q&A, and then Fran can help us with reading some of that up. So now I'll take a deep breath, and I will find a slide. And I'll just read it up. And this is an invitation. We thank you for attending, and we thank you for listening. And we would like to give you a few minutes to reflect on our conversation so far. How has it made you rethink embodiment and pedagogy and embodied pedagogies? And perhaps What moved you, made you curious? And you can type your answers in the Q&A, or you can also raise a hand and then you can be unmuted. But we'll give you just a few minutes to write and think. I see we have some people typing in, and we'll give you a minute more. Yeah, this prompt or invitation is also in the chat. If you still want to respond to it, feel free. And of course, we're open for questions and comments all the way around. But maybe Fran, if the people who wrote in the Q&A,
Sure.
maybe you can read some of their questions and
Absolutely.
responses.
The first is from Grace. I apologize in advance. I'm most likely mispronouncing your name. Grace Beatty. She writes, I know you may not have as much experience with this because of the fields you're in, but how would you suggest some of these principles, such as the method of reverse grading, could be applied to more quantitative STEM fields? It seems more challenging when testing knowledge is looking for one specific objective answer.
I will not have an answer per se, unfortunately, for you, Grace, but I can assure you that if you, a terrible answer, if you Google it, Google will know the answer. Just when I was, because as well, when I introduced it first to my students, I had to do a lot of online research on how other pedagogues use this tool of ungrading or reverse grading, as you called it, and I was really surprised that there was quite a lot of actually people from STEM part of the academia sharing their experience, how they do it. So it's not undoable, right? So I will not try to offer any any answers to that, because I will just expose how terribly unknowledgeable I am at this point of my life with anything connected to STEM. But yeah, it's doable.
Mhm. And I mean, I'm similarly to Nadia, I have very little knowledge about STEM and related fields. But when I was doing at our university, we have an adjunct or assistant professorship pedagogical training. And at our university, that takes 1.5 years and involves us working across with colleagues from different departments of the university. And my peer learner or buddy was from biochemistry. And that was during the time of online teaching for us, because as you mentioned, Nadia, we're having the privilege of most of our teaching now takes place physically on campus. And I saw my colleague meet with his students online and the way students solved problems together and the way they gave peer feedback to each other. And I was really impressed by the level of student involvement. So for me, even though it seems okay, like there's one correct answer, I could see how the way my colleague was working with his students could be extended to the students evaluating themselves and also giving peer feedback. I was very surprised, but I mean, that probably also just exposes my ignorance, because why would I be surprised about that? I'm sure it wouldn't be surprising for many people, this level of interactive teaching in biochemistry.
Just to add a note from Christina in the Q&A, Christina says that if you have a teaching center, they will have support on ungrading, or look online at different teaching centers if you don't have one. And I was also going to if anybody has any recommendations, websites that have been useful to you in this, or indeed anything we've been talking about, please put it in the Q&A or the chat so we can pass that information around. Now to go to the second question, this is from Olga Martinuk, and Olga writes, as a reflection, your conversation made me realize that as a teacher in the class, I often have the privilege to stand up and move in the classroom. My students never do it. I assume the idea of teaching is imposing this bodily performance on us. Next time, I will make a specific note that they are free to stand up or change their body position during the class, meaning in an offline class.
Yeah. And if I may, Olga, thank you for sharing your reflections with us. At some point, we actually were planning to make it a part of our conversation, but then whatever. We are making it part of our conversation now. There's this wonderful practice by one US-based feminist crip scholar, Margaret Price. Margaret calls this access invocation, and it's a short text that Margaret reads out aloud at the beginning of any, I don't know, lecture, public talk, engagement, that Margaret is supposed to be presenting. I'm not sure. Can I send a link here? Will everyone see my? I'll finish talking because I can't multitask now also, and then I'll send the link to the text. What Margaret attempts to do with this text is actually to make us wonder about access, because for majority of people, until we start questioning our ability, right? Access is something obvious, right? For majority of people who are born in quote unquote healthy bodies and with quote unquote healthy minds, even though health is yet another construct and yet another thing to dismantle or attempt to, right? So, and in this text, Margaret goes point by point about what they invite students to do. Use the space how they want to, right? Even if it means walking around or taking out their, I don't know, knitting project or whispering something to a friend, or because for students, it's very difficult to sit. I mean, I wasn't like that. So that's why for a very long time, I couldn't really relate to any attempts to bring body into the classroom, because I was the kind of the student, you go into the classroom and you just turn into this information absorbing sponge. If it was a lecture, good. If the lecture was boring, I found something else to absorb. But I didn't need to use my body. I was really dissociating from it. But for many students, and that's what I think now we should strive to do, is to allow the students to do this, use their body. Use the body in a way that will actually benefit their learning. And yes, that means moving around, lying on the floor if they need to, fidgeting with things, fidgets if they need to, right? So that's a really good practice, I think. Why I gave up on introducing it to you in the beginning, because I'm still not sure how well it can be used in online settings. But I don't know, I'll send the link and maybe somebody will come up with a brilliant idea how to make it usable online. So yes, thank you, Olha, for bringing this
We
up.
have another, oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
Sorry,
Fran.
Linda.
Can I say something to that
Yes,
question?
absolutely.
Because I think in many ways it's easier to use it in an online setting, because I know also myself online, when I can hide, I'm much more comfortable in stretching. I mean, now I was making a point of stretching while Nadia was speaking, but it was also to kind of embody this, right? But also for us, like, I really acknowledge when students knit. I tell them this also affects my nervous system in a positive way to see someone knit. I really find that conducive to an environment that benefits us. But otherwise, I actually cheat. And I want to share this with Olga. Like, I cheat in a way that one thing is I can encourage students, but I'm also in this role of a teacher. And sometimes my encouragement is, like I'm telling them to do things, right? And also, it's not easy. I think that an invitation is something, or a permission is not enough, because people are used to sitting down and they're used to hiding. So when I say cheat, what I mean is that, let's say I divide students in groups to do a group activity. And I would do that by saying, by giving them numbers. Let's say I need 5 groups of students, and I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they have to get up somewhere. And that's both a way of making sure they get to talk across the group. Some people might never talk to each other, but also a way to make them get up instead of just sitting in the groups where they're already sitting. Or sometimes I do a lottery, and then I ask them to come to the front of the room, for example, on which dates they're going to present something. And this is, of course, for an offline teaching setting, for when people are in person. And then instead of me walking with these small notes for the lottery, I asked them to come up and to get a lottery, So I'm kind of trying to make them move without necessarily making it obvious that this is my reason for doing a particular activity in a way. Or sometimes we have the 4 corners of the room and there's 4, let's say, theories or whatever, and I ask them to stand in the corners. So it's I'm kind of trying to make it less, like, also have another point with that, so it's less obvious that this is about making them move. Because I think it's also like some of us, and that was also my experience, moving around in a room, of course, can seem like a little thing to ask, but at some point, I was also a learner who, like, I just like to read books. I was never sporty. I was never, I can really identify, even though later in my life I became someone who enjoys using my body. At some point, I felt much safer just being a mind, thinking that I was just a mind. So I think it's safer for many students to get up if I ask them to come and pick up a note, rather than me saying it's okay to get up if you feel like it.
We have another comment, but I want to just to quickly interject. A couple of years ago, I introduced a couple-minute break halfway through a 75-minute class, and the vast majority of my students hated it. They absolutely hated it. They thought it was disruptive. They were worried that other students weren't going to be able to get back into the conversation. It was that was, a shocker to me. It was really surprising. Anyway, to get to this comment from a question from Jennifer Tischler, she says, based on my own experiences, I am not surprised by your finding that students who present as female might grade themselves lower in your ungraded class, given pervasive emphasis on modesty, etc. Have you addressed this issue either with the entire class or with individuals?
Yeah, thank you for question, Jennifer. I have, yes, with individual students, I just try to, I don't know, offer support and encouragement, and also share with them stories that will make them feel like they are not alone in doing this to themselves, and that actually yeah, it can be overcome or at least it can be problematized. But also after I noticed that this is the thing, again, not a statistical occurrence, but the thing, let's put it in more amorphous terms, I started talking about this, mentioning this precisely when I introduced students to the idea of ungrading. And especially, I mean, for both of my courses, because they are all both course on feminisms, but also the course on sociology of sexuality, they do talk a lot about gender roles and stereotypes and how they imprison us. So I pose this as a question to students to analyze and to think why this is happening, while some part of students tend to give themselves a lower grade, and this helps us to start having or starting a conversation about how terrible society is to little people it decides to train as women. So yeah.
I think I address this, so I have no experience with ungrading, and I hope to. Like, this is another way I'm inspired by you, Nadia. But I sometimes comment on, I say that questions are welcome, and also stupid questions are welcome. And then I sometimes talk about my experiences at different academic gatherings where it's been explicitly addressed, the importance of who asks the first questions and who asks questions and who makes the first comment. And it's not a direct kind of invitation for anyone to not ask questions, but it's also a way to make students aware of who takes space and how they take space. Also because our university has a lot of oral exams. So I mentioned earlier, we have this project work each semester in mixed groups. They're also mixed with regards to gender, but also class, race, other factors that correlate with, and I'll use this word even though, like Nadia, I'm not a statistics expert, but that do correlate with how confident people are and how they take space. And at the oral exams, this can affect someone's grade. If someone is very quiet and shy, and the examiner, which could be me, right, or I'm a censor, but asking a question directly to someone is much more intimidating than the person having a chance to respond to a question that is asked to a group. So in these oral exams, there's really a risk of reproducing these kinds of gendered, raced, classed patterns evaluating someone's performance higher. So that is another setting where we talk about that. I talk about that with the group when we prepare for the exam, and we also usually say that as part of the introduction to the exam, that sometimes it can happen that there are some group members who have an easier time to voice their opinions, and some people also are quicker, right? And that it's good for every one of us to be aware of these differences and to give each other space. Yeah. I wanted to, if I have because I think now we don't have any more questions in the, we have some feedback from Christina, who says that people trained as women is something that Christina wrote down and appreciates that statement. And then Christina also says that they really appreciate points about oral exams. Yeah. Otherwise, I wanted to ask you, Nadia, actually, how you find support and how you find allies or spaces where you can be, supported and held in the work that you do.
Well, that was quite a question to ask. Not in academic settings. Let's put it this way. Even though, again, that's a bit of exaggeration, because I guess due to combination of luck and privilege and whatnot, I have people in academia who either support me because they support me, or for whatever reason, doesn't matter. I feel some sort of institutional or emotional support, but quite often this comes from different people. Only rarely you can have this coming from the same person. But yes, mainly my support comes from not academic environments. It's mainly people whom I got to know through the queer feminist networks in Kyiv, but also some people whom actually I got to know. Well, yeah. Sorry, I'll skip to the non-people part, because for me, definitely a lot of support comes from the non-humans, and I think that another additional event in this series should be about non-human bodies, because I think that's also a very interesting and underexplored topic to discuss for a variety of reasons and from a variety of perspectives. But for me, cats and plants, yes, I am living up to this wonderful stereotype of a crazy cat and plant person. But yes, but again, this is a support which may seem trivial, but also this is the support which helped me to survive through rather few difficult and challenging years of teaching in Kyiv. So yeah.
Yeah, I asked the question because I think that for me it's also part of that I'm kind of learning to recognize the impact that being in academia has on my body, and how I make that engagement more survivable for myself. And I also thought it was very important you said not within the university, which echoes for me Christina's question in the beginning about institutions that are, if I remember correctly, Christina wrote, are anti-body. Yeah. And also because we spoke when we were preparing for the panel, we spoke about alliances, and I mentioned the student who wrote this master's thesis about the experiences of neurodivergent students, who was part of founding a network for neurodivergent students at our university, and they have been coming to our semester start this week. And I mean, I didn't do that for them to support me, but I feel that that is one example of I mean, I could call that a collaboration maybe, but then I'm very aware of that I didn't pay them, and that I don't have a budget to pay them at the moment. So that is, of course, not a good starting point for a collaboration. But I feel that I feel very supported when these kinds of initiatives happen close to me, and when I feel that we can have an exchange that is mutually supportive. Yeah.
Absolutely agree with you. And yes, I'm now I'm worried because, of course, in addition to everything else, I'm an over warrior. Let's add in that to the mix too, right? But now I'm worried that I didn't give enough of credit. What a terrible. Okay, I'll just go on with this terrible phrase. Give the credit where credit is due, and we'll say that yes, also humans actually do provide me with a lot of support, and specifically getting together with people with whom you can openly talk about things like how terrible academia actually is. And how, rather than serving its declared valiant purpose, it actually, I don't know, traumatizes students, traumatizes lecturers and professors. And again, I'm not sure. I guess that in Western academia, maybe somebody still benefits from this process. In Ukraine, maybe managerial class, but I think that in Ukraine, people who are in academia, yeah, I often ask this question: why people in Ukraine are still remaining in academia? That's a difficult question to even start imagining answers to that. But yes, what I'm trying to say is that gathering together with other people and having open conversations, even if these conversations can be like a series of awkward silences. But if those silences are in response or elicited by some important points that you're trying to make collectively, that's really, really supportive and helps a lot. Yes.
And also voicing our worries.
Yeah.
So I see now that we're supposed to hand over now to Sarah, and I just want to thank you, Nadia. And now, really, really, really thank you. And also, again, thanks to the audience, and we'll pass this on to Sarah.
Thank you, Linda and Nadia. And I want to thank Christina for the perfect closing comment. Christina writes, I so appreciate how genuine and authentic you both have been during this panel. The wisdom and experiences you both have shared has been very inspiring and resonates. And with that, excuse me, on behalf of the organizing centers, ASSIS, and all co-sponsoring institutions, let me thank Fran, Linda, Nadia, and our audience members for such a deeply meaningful conversation today. Before we close, I'd like to remind you that our 6th and final session will take place Friday, February 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And Alicia will drop the link to register for that in the chat in a moment. Our final panel is titled Body Matters and Liberation in East European and Eurasian Studies. Sarah Phillips of Indiana University will serve as our moderator, and the panel will feature speakers Balaji Balagan of SOAS University of London, Cassandra Hartblay of the University of Toronto, Kimberly St. Julian Varnon of the University of Pennsylvania, and Daria Krivonas of the University of Helsinki. As mentioned before, all panels in this series are being recorded, professionally captioned, and made available within a few days after each session on the program web pages of the 3 organizing centers. If you have any questions about accessibility or wish to request accommodations, please contact CEAS at OSU EDU 2 weeks ahead of time. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next and final session later this month. Goodbye.